reading verse 7 just summarizes the number of people that were multiplied. Remember, Jacob's family were 70 in all that moved to Egypt. And over a period of 430 years, which is the time they spent there, they multiplied, and they multiplied greatly. And that's emphasized here in this first book of Exodus. Verse 7, and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. If you remember the story of Joseph, they went to Pharaoh to find out where he could put his brothers, and Pharaoh said, well, since they are shepherds, let's put them in the greenest pastures. Let's put them in the nicest places. And they said, in the land of Goshen is where they will go. And that's where they were shepherds, and they prospered, and they continued to multiply. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the numbers of the children of Israel, because many people say, many of the scholars and the sociologists and the archaeologists, look at the number of 2 million people coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, and they said that can't possibly be 2 million people marching out of the gates of a city in Egypt and going into the wilderness and surviving for 40 years. It's just not reasonable to think that's possible. And yet, if we did the numbers, here's what I propose to you. Do the numbers. Do your own family. I'll do mine. There's my mom and my dad. So my dad would be the primary starter of the generations. My dad had 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl. If each one of those had 3 children, then it would multiply exponentially. And each of those children beyond that would have another 3 children. It would multiply exponentially. So it would be something like this. You'd have 6, and then you would have 18, and then it would go up and up and up and up, and you do 14 generations and find out how many you have. Now, I challenge you to do the numbers. I loved doing this when I was a teenager, and when I was a little boy, I'd sit in church with the offering envelope, and I'd start doing mathematical formulas. How long did I live? How many seconds have I lived? How many days? How many weeks? How many months? So I thought that was fascinating. And so when I come to this, I have the same kind of feeling. I'd like to know the numbers. Let me see that if I multiplied my family by 4 or 5 generations, what would it end up to be? And by my calculations, most families would multiply over 100 years to be nearly 1,200 people, if you do the math. Now, with the people of Israel, it was different. They multiplied exceedingly. That means they didn't have 3 kids. Jacob had 12. Actually, in one passage, it says he had 14, counting the daughters that he had. And then you multiply the children and their children, children's children. Each of them were having 8 to 10 children. You do that kind of mathematical formula, and if everybody were still alive after 430 years, you would have multi-millions of people. But you have death and attrition and all the rest. So it doesn't seem so extreme to say that there were 2 million people in the family of Israel when they left Egypt. I challenge you to do some of the numbers on that. There are other discussions by people that think this is not really true, that it couldn't possibly be that they had that many people. How would you manage those people? What are the logistics that you would need for this? And some people have done some incredible numbers to figure this out. And they've said with 200 million people, we're saying 200 million because the scripture says there were 600,000 men 20 years old or older that could serve in the military, and that excluded the names of those from the tribe of Levi because they weren't warriors and they weren't going to inherit any land. So that's significant. 600,000 men over 20 years old. And if you look into the book of Numbers, there's a reason why we call it Numbers. It's about the numbers, and they did a census of Israel, and they found there were 603,550, and they said they counted them not by noses. They didn't just count the people lined up. They counted each one by name and by tribe and organized them in that way. So there was quite specific numbers that were going into this. So somebody says, what would they do about the latrine? What would they do with their bathroom facilities? You got 2 million people traveling along. Do you realize how massive that crowd is? By some estimations, if you had the crowd of people lined up It would be 10 miles long and a half-mile wide. Some say it would be, if it was a square, and they did encamp in a square, with each tribe in different squares, it would be 5 miles by 5 miles. That's a large territory. Or if it was 20 miles long and the lines were a quarter of a mile wide, still, that's a long line of people. I think of the buffalo that used to cross America, and the settlers that described them as miles and miles through the grassy plains, and you would see this pathway of the buffaloes after they flowed through. The people of Israel must have been like that. Somebody else said, what would you do with the latrine duties? And let me explain that. In Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verses 12 and 13, it described what they had to do. They had to go without the camp. So they were camped in 12 different groups. They had to go outside that group carrying a shovel. And when they did their duty, they would cover it with a shovel. And imagine if you had 10 kids and those kids didn't know how to do that, you're going to have to spend much of your day doing latrine duty. Then they talk about the food. How much food would it require to feed 2 million people every day for 40 years? Someone has estimated that at 1,500 tons of food daily. Wow. So you look at it, people without faith will look at that and say, it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible to do that. But that's one of the things God wanted to show them, that God is the God of the impossible. Throughout the book of Exodus, you will find that God says over and over, so that you will know me. I am doing these great and mighty miracles so that you will know that I am the Lord. He said it to the Egyptians. He said it to the Israelites. I want you to know me. I am the God of the impossible. I can move mountains. I can make manna come from heaven. Nothing is impossible with God. Then we come to the water. Somebody has estimated 11 million gallons of water a day to feed or to water these people and their animals. Remember, there were animals, there were cattle, there were horses, there were probably camels and other animals that were all with them. They all had to have water in the desert. So God had to provide that. So all of this shows us that this was not a small number. And some of the commentators want us to believe that the word for heads of families, the word there is a word that can be talked about as captains of families. So 600,000 wasn't really 600,000. It was more like 6,000. And then they estimate that maybe there were 25 or 27,000 men that left Egypt and their families. And that would make it more manageable. It makes more sense. My friend, the Bible doesn't make sense. The Bible tells the truth and shows the miraculous power of God to keep the people of Israel. Those are some of the things I wanted you to note in this passage as the people multiplied in Egypt.